But now I'd like to introduce Mike Nagle. And Mike, since I've joined the museum, has become our annual January tradition. And we're particularly excited this year because he's unveiling his new book for us. It was actually released in November, but it's our first public unveiling here. And anyone who's been in the history world knows that it's not necessarily easy to market a history book to a wide audience. So we're hoping that you'll spread the word about his great books. He's got two, Justice Stearns on Michigan Pine King and Kentucky Oil Baron. And then tonight we're going to be hearing him talk about the Forgotten Iron King of the Great Lakes. Mike is the type of social studies instructor that those who don't like social studies or history should have had, because I was blessed to have people like him that really stimulate you to think about things outside of the box and make history exciting. But a little bit about his background. Mike holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in education and a Master of Arts degree in history from Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. He teaches history and political science at West Shore Community College in Scottsville, and he's also serves as the chair of their social services or sciences division. He's an award-winning teacher and noted speaker covering a range of topics in American and Michigan history and student success and retention in the online classroom, which has become more and more important as we were talking about in the last couple of years. We mentioned his first book on Justice Stearns, and that won the Kentucky History Award. And his new book was just published by Wayne State University Press. We encourage you to pick up a copy here. And welcome, Mike. And Mike is here with his wife, Buffy, and they reside in Ludington.
Well, I might walk around a little bit. I hope that's okay, and I'll also try to make sure that I keep my mouth close to the microphone. We're good. Okay. All right. Well, let me just kind of begin by saying thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. I've come to a lot of these events. We were trying to think if it was 10, 15 years, and lately it's been in January. We actually saw the sun today. Wasn't that wonderful? I've been here in days when it's been so cold and we've had a lot of snow, and it's been wonderful to see people come out for that. And this is a great crowd here today. So thank you for coming. I say this all the time, but I just want to say it again. My students supposedly are in class because they want to be there. Okay, they're in college, they want to be there. But I think in a lot of cases, they feel as if they're required. You all chose to come today, so thank you. I really appreciate it. Okay. Writing a history book is a lot of work. This took 7 years, and it was quite an undertaking. But one of the things that I like to say is that history can be fun. All right. And so I think that's what I kind of tried to do with my research and with a lot of the writing, because history is more than just an act passed by Congress, some battles that have taken place, or presidential administrations, or monarchs. It's a story. And hopefully what I can do today is to tell you a bit of a story about an interesting figure. But I also want to talk about some of the neat things that came about with my research, because I got to meet a real live princess as part of my research for this book. So I will tell more, I'll provide more detail here in a little bit later, but one of Eber Ward's daughters married a prince from Belgium. And this was in the 1890s. And so my wife and I traveled, and I should say this, I want to thank West Shore Community College, because they granted me they approved a sabbatical for 1 semester, and that allowed me to spend extra time on this. And one of the things that Buffy and I did was we traveled to Belgium. And so that's the castle. It was Chimay Castle was the name of the castle where the prince was located. And on the right there, you see me speaking with Elizabeth, who was the Princess of Chimay a few years ago, and she was 92 years old when I was able to meet with her. And they treated me so well. I walked around and they're like, "Are you the professor from the United States?" And it was really kind of a neat experience. But Eber Ward's daughter, her name was Clara. She was married to Prince Joseph from Belgium for about 6 years. And then she divorced her husband and was involved in a series of sex scandals, one could argue. And I'll tell more detail about that. But so I went and I talked to Princess Elizabeth and I said, "Well, what can you tell us about Clara?" And she looked at me and she said, "We don't talk about her. She was very pretty, but she was fast." And I thought to myself, her native language, she spoke Flemish and French, and she spoke English. But I was wondering, does fast in this context mean the same thing? And yes, was the answer to that question. And it just made me want to learn more and more about Princess Clara and her father. So that was one of the really neat things that kind of keeps you going. If you've got a project like this, you need to get motivated because it takes a long time. And so that was one of the great things that just, got me so more excited about the story. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to Bois Blanc Island, often pronounced Bois Blanc Island. It's near Mackinac Island. It's really neat. Well, Eber Ward's father was the lighthouse keeper for several years at Bois Blanc Island. And Eber lived with his father there for 2 years. And so I wanted to travel to the island to check it out. And Buffy and I went, and it's if you've never been and you want to experience a rustic island, it's near Mackinac, and it does allow for automobiles. The speed limit is 25 miles an hour on the entire island, and there are no paved roads. But we loved it. It was great. So anyway, I knew that I wanted to see the lighthouse. And so we had our mountain bikes. And so we started on a trail because I heard that it was out toward this trail. And you can see what the trail looked like there on the left. And as we went a short distance and we came across some other people, and one of the gentlemen said, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I really want to see the lighthouse." And he said, "Well, that's in private property." And I said, "Yes, but I don't want to intrude on anyone's private property, but I understand that they're okay if you walk around the beach." And he's like, "Well, it's pretty tough to get there." And I said, "Yes, but I'm writing this book and I really want to learn more about it." And he said, "All right, well, my grandmother was one of the lighthouse keepers." Can you believe that here I happened to run into him, and it was great. He gave us a little bit more direction, and we continued on. I mean, we were on our mountain bikes for more than a half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. And I was thinking to myself, I can't drag her, to do much more of this, maybe 5 more minutes. And then we saw the sign right here. And we were able to see the lighthouse. This wasn't the same one that Eber Ward was at, but it was just kind of neat to be able to see that. And so those are a couple of the neat things associated with the research. And you just need to have those, I think, every so often if you've got a project that's that major, I guess you could say. But I guess I should talk about Eber Ward. On the left, you see a huge painting of Eber Brock Ward. I wanted this to be on the cover of the book. I mean, when I saw it, it is a physically large painting. It's 10 feet tall, 5 feet wide. And just as Eber Ward dominates the canvas of this painting, he dominated the economy, business life, and many aspects of life in Michigan throughout his lifetime. When he died in 1875, he was the richest man in Michigan. And I'll talk about some of his exploits. But on the right, we see a couple of quotations from people who knew him, some contemporaries. One person described him as a man of mild and agreeable manners. He was open-hearted. He was generous. Another, this was his cousin, described him as being selfish, largely devoid of a conscience. He was tyrannical, vindictive, and aggressive, and he engaged in illegitimate and dishonest schemes. So how could this be? How could the same person be described in this manner? Well, maybe you can think about this, and at the end of the presentation, I'll come back to it, and you can see which you think is better describes his life. So Eber Ward was actually born in Canada in 1811 on Christmas Day. His parents were from Vermont. So they had his father moved around a bit, and his family moved around a bit when he was young. So they were from Vermont, spent a short time in Canada. Shortly after this, the War of 1812 began between the United States and the British. And so he only lived in Canada for a very short time. His one key event that took place when he was young was that his mother died when he was 6 years old. The family was actually on its way from New England, and they were going to relocate to Kentucky because his dad had spent a short time in Kentucky, and he wanted to move there for the economic opportunities. But his mother died. And so they decided to remain in the area of the Great Lakes because that's where their family was. But if his mother hadn't died, then they probably would have ended up in the South. And so we're lucky, I guess, that this tragedy happened because he was able to contribute to our state and our area. One thing I did want to mention, though, was that while Eber's father really wanted to spend time in Kentucky and to move there, he was very uncomfortable with slavery. And he described slaveholders as hypocrites. And Eber would inherit this opposition to slavery. We'll see that in a bit. If you're not familiar with Marine City, they ended up moving to Marine City after his mom died. And so I've got an arrow pointing to it there, and that's where Eber spent his formative years. He was there. His uncle had already moved there, and so that's where he lived. And his dad was gone at times. However, he was with family. A key figure that influenced his life, in addition to his father, would be his uncle. His uncle is shown here, Samuel Ward. He was involved in shipping in the Great Lakes. Beginning at the age of 11, Eber started to work for his uncle as a cabin boy, just kind of running errands on the various vessels. And he didn't work with him all the time, but on and off from this early age. But he began to work for him full time in his early 20s, beginning in 1832. And so he was his uncle's employee. Then he became his uncle's protege, and eventually he became his uncle's partner. A bit of context, I think, can be helpful here because Michigan entered the Union in 1837 as a state. It experienced a tremendous amount of population growth throughout, particularly the 1830s, 1840s. And people, we're familiar with people traveling westward on the Oregon Trail or overland trails. Well, people also took steamboats. You could be in New York City, travel up the Hudson, go across New York on the Erie Canal, and get into the Great Lakes. And a lot of people started their journeys that way. And some ended up going to the West Coast, but many ended up in what they initially called the Old Northwest, like Ohio, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, in this area. But you could just see those statistics. Eber's uncle became involved in the shipping industry at a good time, transporting people as well as goods throughout the Great Lakes. And Eber becomes his partner. On the left, you see a number of vessels that Eber's uncle and then eventually Eber would, as his partner, would end up building. Almost one a year, beginning in 1843, 1844. By 1849, they're so successful, there's 2. 1851, there are 3. Initially, Samuel, Eber's uncle, only had sailboats or schooners, but shortly after Eber becomes his partner, Samuel and Eber invest in a steamboat. And on the right, we see the first steamboat that the pair had, and that was the Huron. Probably Eber, in the younger entrepreneur, the one who was willing to take risks, encouraged his uncle to invest in steamboats. They were much more expensive. However, that was the future, and you didn't have to worry about the wind, and things could be transported much more quickly with a steamboat as opposed to a schooner. Here we see one of the oldest photos taken by someone in the state of Michigan. It's possible this is the oldest photo. On the left, we see Eber as a young man. He's got a book in his hand. He's dressed in a business suit, very professional, and he's got an image of a vessel next to him. Here he is. The message that he's trying to portray here is, oh yeah, I'm in business. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to make lots of money. Here I am. What we also see is don't mess with me and don't try to compete with me is some of the things that we'll see in his character. On the right is his wife, Polly. In 1837, Eber got married. Eber and Polly were married, and Eber and Polly were actually cousins. Polly was the niece of Samuel Ward's wife. Okay, so they were not cousins by blood, but they were cousins. Okay, do I dare say kissing cousins? Okay, all right. And so this was a popular match. The two of them knew each other. It also helped Eber in his relationship with his uncle, because Polly was actually raised by Samuel and his wife, Elizabeth was her name, because her parents had passed away. And it also turns out that Samuel Ward had one son who was described as mentally handicapped. You know, he was mentally challenged. And so Eber became the son that Samuel Ward never had in many ways, which would eventually help him inherit his uncle's vast business enterprises. On the right, we see Polly, who is dressed formally, but there's the only thing that we see with her really is a child. And so here she's representing herself, not in business, but as a reflection of the expectations associated with women in the 19th century. Wife, a mother, a person who will take care of the homestead. Eventually, Eber and Polly would have 8 children. 7 would reach adulthood. However, their marriage would end in divorce, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Eber and Samuel's fleet of vessels continued to grow. They were very successful. By the 1840s and 1850s, they had one of, if not the largest fleet of vessels in the Great Lakes. And one of the things that I also like to point out here, if you can see this right here, just in case you can't see it out there, it says E.B. Ward's warehouse. So not only did they have this huge fleet of vessels transporting goods, but they also had warehouses where those goods were stored. And so there was a huge enterprise that he and his uncle had. When Samuel Ward died in 1854, Eber inherited the bulk of their business. And so let me kind of go like this. Any study of Eber Brock Ward needs to begin at the Detroit Public Library in the Burton collection. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with this, but it's a wonderful collection of Michigan historical records. And one of the things that they have there, and there's a lot of correspondence that Eber Ward had, but also many ledger books. And what we see with one of his ledger books is that at the top it says E.B. So it says, whoops. So E.B. and S. Ward's property owned on equal joint account. So clearly by 1851, 1852, Eber and Samuel, it's not protege, they were equal partners. And the value that they had, more than $500,000, can be translated to $17.5 million in today's money. So we're talking a lot of money and a lot of success. Just one thing, I mentioned before that, I tried to, as I was doing research, I made several trips to Detroit. I live in Ludington, so that's a long drive. But I had one daughter who was going to school at Wayne State University and another daughter who was at Eastern Michigan University. So I was able to go there and spend time with them while I was on a research trip sometimes. So that was another thing that was really kind of neat for me as I'm going along, just to try to, continue to keep me motivated. Eber and Samuel Ward had this huge, vast fleet of vessels, but he didn't stop there. In 1853, he formed an iron company, and this was the Eureka Iron Company. Then they produced a range of products, whether it was iron rails, and a range of other merchantable commodities that were from iron. And so by 1860, he was one of the largest employers in the state of Michigan, and he had the largest factory with a payroll of $20,000 after 1866. That'd be the year after the Civil War. So he was in the shipping industry, but he was also in iron production. But he didn't stop there. In 1857, he founded the North Chicago Rolling Mill, and this was an even bigger facility. Eventually, this would become part of Andrew Carnegie's holdings, and eventually an important part of U.S. Steel. And over 500 employees, and he always would employ the latest technology at his facilities. And he even founded another company in 1867, and that was in Milwaukee. And so this prompted the Chicago Tribune to describe him as the Iron King of the West in 1873. And he had more than 5,000 employees, and they supported between 15 and 20,000 other people. So he's a major player, not just in Michigan, but throughout the Great Lakes. So here we see his major facilities in Wyandotte, just south of Detroit, Chicago, as well as Milwaukee. A major player. His greatest triumph, I don't know if you know much about steel, iron versus steel, but the Bessemer process was the most efficient method of producing steel. And Eber Ward was the first in the United States to produce steel using the Bessemer method. That was something that was patented in England and developed in England. What was I going to say? And that was at his Wyandotte facility where he had that. While this is a great triumph and wonderful, he was a tough person to work for. As many of his contemporaries, he did not like unions at all. And he strove to destroy those, and he wanted to control aspects of his employees' lives, not just while they were working, but even when they were at home. And if you lived in company housing and you were found to have alcohol, you could lose your job and your home. He consistently tried to ban alcohol consumption among his employees. And he described unions as wrong and tyrannical. Just a side note, I remembered what I wanted to say with this iron versus steel. The railroad industry was arguably the leading industry in the United States the years immediately before and then after the Civil War. And if you're going to have railroads, you're going to need railroad tracks. Iron rails were initially used, but they would have to be replaced within 2 years or so. Steel rails could last 10 years and even longer. Much of the Bessemer steel a lot of that was being imported from England. And so the fact that in the United States they were producing Bessemer steel was really, really significant. But Ward didn't stop there. If railroads were the leading industry, well, he also was involved in railroads. He was a major stockholder in the Detroit and Milwaukee Railway, but then he became the president of the Flint and Pierre Marquette Railroad. So it started in Monroe, Michigan, kind of on the Ohio border, and it went across the entire state of Michigan, and it ended in Ludington, and it was completed by 1874. This was a land grant railroad. What the state did and the federal government allowed for was that for every mile of track that was built, the railroad would receive 6 sections of land, and a section of land is 1 square mile. So for every mile of track that was built, 6 square miles of property went to the railroad companies because it was so expensive to try to build the railroads. And it also, then they would sell that property, and then the more people would travel to the areas out west. Just as a comparison, in order to build the Transcontinental Railroad, for every mile of track that was built, the companies received 20 sections of land. Here, it was 6 sections of land. But Eber Ward served as president of the Flint and Pierre Marquette from 1860 until his death in 1875. But he didn't stop there. He was also involved in the lumber industry. And he came into conflict with James Ludington from the Ludington area. So Eber Ward had 70,000 acres on either side of the Pierre Marquette River. And he wanted to, and so he was ready to develop that and to cut those trees down. Well, what he needed was a mill site, and James Ludington owned the property. And James Ludington knew that he had a little bit of leverage over, Eber Ward. And so Ward contacted him, and they tried to negotiate, and they continued to negotiate and negotiate and negotiate. And what happened is that James Ludington dragged his feet, and he did not want to sell the property to Eber Ward. I know some of this because the Ludington family papers are in New York City. And I got to go on another cool trip. They're at the New York Historical Society, and Buffy and I went, and I researched during the day and looked at the archives. She went to museums, and at night we went to a couple shows. And so, again, it's one of those things where if you can, it takes a long time, and it's hard to continue your motivation with a long project like that. But history can be fun, and you can go to these cool places. So. Ward got frustrated with James Ludington and the fact that he wouldn't sell this property. So as it turns out, some of James Ludington's lumber crews trespassed on Eber Ward's property and cut down some of his trees. When Eber Ward found out about it, he didn't do anything. But the next time James Ludington came to Detroit, Ward had Ludington arrested, thrown in jail. Suddenly, James Ludington decides that he's willing to sell the property that Eber Ward wants. So he eventually got that property. And 2 of the largest sawmills on Pierre Marquette Lake in the Ludington area were built by Eber Ward. Little closer to home here, in Leland, there was a company called the Leland Lake Superior Iron Company, and it experienced some financial problems after a fire in 1871. The next year, in 1872, Eber Ward purchases this company. And the reason why is because Leland had a nice natural port. It's 80 miles from Escanaba, where Eber Ward owned property, and Escanaba was a great port. And so Eber Ward reorganizes the company, and they eventually produce pig iron in Leland that was then shipped to Chicago, to Wyandotte, to Milwaukee, to Eber Ward's facilities. And on the right, you see a photo that shows a lot of the lumber that was then burned in those so-called beehives to transform it into charcoal in order to then run the furnaces for the iron mill. I got to keep it close to my mouth, don't I? So we're good? Okay. So how and why was he so darn successful? Because he consistently reinvested his profits back into his companies, and he engaged in vertical integration. So Eber Ward owned the property where the iron ore was located. He owned the vessels that transported the iron ore to his facilities. He owned the iron and steel mills. He then controlled the railroads that purchased the products that were produced at his iron and steel mills. He also owned timbered property, the sawmills, and then the vessels or railroads to transport the 2x4s, you know, from the timber that gets transformed into 2x4s and other, you know, products. And so he engaged in vertical integration decades before people like Andrew Carnegie, who made it even more famous, and developed these efficiencies that he developed, really were a major factor as to why he was so successful. How about his private life? The most important relationship throughout his entire lifetime was with his sister, Emily Ward. Emily never married. She often is referred to as Aunt Emily because Eber and Emily had two sisters. They both died young, and Emily ended up raising the children, like her nieces and nephews, from her sisters. Eber paid the bills. Emily raised the children. And Emily also had a lifelong dream of being able to educate children. And so in 1845, she opened what was called a Newport Academy. The city of Marine City today used to be called Newport. So it was located in what is today Marine City. This had an expanded curriculum, you know, Latin, chemistry, things like that. Emily was not the teacher, but she hired the teacher. She served as the principal. She served as a school board, a superintendent. She also served as a school board of one member. Okay. She had, if anyone had a complaint, she held original jurisdiction and appellate jurisdiction as well, as one of her contemporaries described her. Just as Eber ran his businesses with an iron fist, well, what is it? The apple didn't fall far from the tree. Okay, brother and sister managed things in a very similar manner. Politically, Eber Ward was a Whig, and then he became a strong member of the Republican Party. And one of the positions that the Republican Party was opposed to the expansion of slavery, and Eber Ward was very much opposed to slavery. In the 1850s, there was an event called Bleeding Kansas. In Kansas, there was a mini civil war that took place between the supporters of slavery and opponents of slavery. When this mini civil war broke out, there were fundraisers. And as you see here, Aid for Kansas is the name of that article. Eber Ward was one of the major contributors to this, and he gave $10,000 to this cause. In addition to this, Eber Ward was described as a contemporary as a radical on the issue of slavery. His vessels, at least 3 of his vessels, were known to be friendly to runaway slaves. So a runaway slave may come to Detroit or in other areas of the Great Lakes and then get transported to freedom in Canada. Eber Ward I take that back. Eber Ward spoke with one of his new employees, and this new employee related what Ward had to say. If a runaway slave was to come to one of the vessels, they were supposed to allow that runaway slave to come on the ship for free. And there was a particular compartment where they could go, and they would be hidden there, and then they would be dropped off once they got to Canada. And in fact, in one particular case, there were a series of runaways, and their owner was chasing after them and got on the same ship. The owner discovered that they were there. Eber Ward happened to be on that ship. He was told what had happened, and he said, "I know what we can do." They went out, and he talked to the captain, and they went out into the to the Canadian shoreline, and they stopped the ship. and then they lowered a rowboat. And they allowed those slaves to go over to Canada, and he made sure that the slaves had at least $1 with them, so that they would just, they wouldn't just show up in Canada without any money. So he very much was an opponent of slavery and a supporter of the Union during the Civil War. When he was young, he said that money doesn't buy you happiness. Literally, usually in January, he would write a letter that was very reflective to members of his family. And it was like it was pretty consistent that there would be one in January, after the shipping season had ended, and he was able to have a little bit more time. He would write these reflective letters. And in one of them, he declared that money does not buy you happiness. Yet, I would argue he succumbed to the excesses of the era in which he lived, because he worked day and night, 24/7, 365 practically, to try to amass a huge empire. Initially, I would argue he was terribly competitive, but then he really, and that's what motivated him. But then I think he liked the luxury, and you can see that is his home. And it's a photo taken from the 1870s, I believe. A contemporary described his family life as very unsatisfactory. And he was married to Polly for about 30 years. They had 8 children, but then they divorced. And Polly died within a few months of their divorce. And Eber married a woman who was 30 years younger than him. Her name was Catherine Lyon, and they would eventually have 2 children. And so you see Polly on the left and Catherine, who was described as a beauty queen, on the right. Here's Eber Ward. Big player politically, nationally in many cases. He was a major business leader in the state of Michigan, but he also was involved in many national organizations. In 1869, at the age of 58, because he was pushing himself so hard, I would argue, he had a stroke. But he survived that, and he was able to go back to work within a month or so, but he continued on that very vigorous schedule. In 1873, a so-called panic took place. These days, we call them depressions, economic depressions, or a recession, or a financial crisis. Okay. In the 19th century, they called them panics. There was an economic downturn, a major economic downturn. I mentioned before that the railroad industry was maybe the most important industry, the leading industry. Well, by the 1870s, there were, as one historian put it, too many tracks searching for too many customers. And so they expanded too quickly. And so there was that sparked an overall economic depression. And when the railroad companies stopped building railroad tracks, that meant that the iron and steel companies weren't selling the iron and steel. And so this impacted Ward's holdings and added to stress. And eventually he had a second stroke, and he died early in 1875 at the age of 63. But he was the richest man in Michigan when he died. And he had a family from his first marriage, several children, and he also had a wife from his second marriage, and he, his second wife had 2 young children at this point. There was a huge battle over his will. This was a conflict that not only riveted people in the state of Michigan, but it actually gained national headlines. And I don't know if you can tell. Oh, well, it does say. So the New York Times, this is the headline from the New York Times from 1875, Extraordinary Revelations at the Trial. It was a case without parallel, in part because Eber Ward, prior to his death, became interested in spiritualism, and he was painted as this kook who was trying to communicate with people who were dead, and that he was getting advice from mediums. Just a side note, again, a little context. The spiritualism was very popular in the United States, particularly after the Civil War, as many people lost family members during the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famous abolitionist, Mary Todd Lincoln had seances at the White House. Horace Greeley, a leading media figure, newspaper man, he attended seances. And if you think about this, some new pieces of technology, like in this era, made people think about communication. Photography, okay, was a new piece of technology. If you could capture the image of someone, maybe you could talk to people in the afterlife. If you can communicate by using a cable, like a Ouija board, like maybe that's how you could contact people. But I'm also thinking of the telegraph. Okay, the telegraph allowed information that was discovered on the East Coast to be transported to the West Coast like that. And once the transatlantic cable, you could transport information, or you can transmit information to Europe just like that. So why not use a Ouija board, okay, to be able to interact with people who had died? And so it became kind of an entertainment thing. I would argue that Ward went to these things because he was entertained by them, but he was presented as this person who was getting advice from mediums and others. Eventually, they settled out of court, and Eber's second wife received the bulk of his estate, to the detriment of the children from his first marriage. Once Catherine had this money, she had a plan for it. And she had a lot of money. She was in the United States, but she wanted to marry her daughter to royalty so that they could get a title in the family. In the era of the 1890s, there were many so-called dollar princesses, where Americans had this money, as the United States was industrializing and they wanted the prestige of a title. And so Clara Ward on the right was one of these dollar princesses. She was 16 years old when she met and eventually married Prince Joseph from Belgium. And initially, she was loved by the press. Everyone thought that her disdain of tradition was quaint, but then she left her prince after several years of marriage, and she ran off with a Hungarian violinist. You have to watch out for those musicians, okay? So here she was married to this prince, who she described as being very cold. He was nice, but he was very cold. And she became enthralled with Rigo, this Hungarian violinist. A contemporary has described her as a paparazzi princess, because even though she was criticized by the local press and in the United States, just like the title there is, she's ruined her life. She's gone with a gypsy. Is kind of the title and the mood of that article. But the press still could not leave her behind. And in part because she decided to make a little money on the side and to capitalize on her fame. And so in the middle there that is a postcard, or a portion of a postcard. She would hold performances where she would wear a bodysuit that simulated nudity. This is in the 1890s. And Rigo, sometimes she would perform with Rigo, as you see him there, and he would play his violin. Sometimes she wouldn't. Apparently, Rigo didn't like it if he wasn't there at the performance. At times, they literally ended the performance because they believed it was too scandalous. She also capitalized on her fame by selling her image to a range of things, bicycles, in this case, cigarettes, a range of things. And she had international headlines along the way. And so it was just an amazing thing. Here, I'm very sympathetic to her. Okay. And I'm sympathetic because she was 16 years old and she got stuck in this marriage. And then she's, and that her mom forced her into, and then she's just decided, you know what, I'm going to leave him and I'm going to do whatever I want. Most women in this era did not have the financial resources to do whatever they want and to be able to leave their husbands. And so just as her father decided to run his businesses however he wanted and to go after any competitors, she decided to live her own life as she felt she should go. Eber Ward died in 1875, and he was the richest man in Michigan, but his legacy was largely forgotten. Why? Well, he was intensely competitive. I only mentioned one example of the conflict with James Ludington. If you crossed him, he was willing to crush you. I would argue that in The Prince, Machiavelli says it's better to be feared than loved. Whether or not Eber Ward read The Prince, I don't know, but he would have adopted that mantra, or he would have agreed with that. So he had a lot of enemies, and he also went after unions. So a lot of his former employees had a bitter taste in their mouth. The impact of that trial ruined or lessened his reputation because he was portrayed as someone who was influenced by spiritualists. His wife, Catherine, schemed to get his money. And so any family member who wanted to protect their father's legacy, all that energy that they could have put into the family name and in protecting their father's name, and that it went into fighting Catherine and to try to get the money. By the way, for 20 years, they continued to try to they used the court system to try to get access to more of the money. And if there was anything left, any energy or anything, really, Clara overshadowed her father by the 1890s because of her exploits as a princess and someone who left a prince. So here we are, back at this painting and these quotations. Was he more open-hearted and generous, or was he tyrannical, vindictive, and aggressive? Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of a rhetorical question, and maybe I'll just say, you know what? Maybe it's both. Okay. So clearly he tried to control his employees' lives. All right. So he clearly was tyrannical and aggressive. He went after anyone who was a competitor with as much vengeance as he could. Yet at the same time, he was a horrible father, horrible husband. But at the same time, on the key moral issue of his life and in the era in which he lived, slavery, okay, he was on the right side of that issue. Okay. One other thing, and I didn't mention it, there were a group of business leaders in the 1860s during the Civil War who were frustrated at the income tax, the very first income tax that was put into place by the U.S. government. And they appealed to Eber Ward to say, hey, would you come out and would you join us and be opposed to this darn income tax? Because we don't want to pay this income tax. And Eber Ward wrote back and wrote a public letter and said, I'm happy to pay these taxes. I'm happy to pay these taxes because they're going toward the preservation of the Union and toward a just cause. As soon as the war is over, I want him dropped. And he fought to do that. However, I would argue that on the key moral issue of his day, he was on the right side. Okay. Whoops. So, whoops. Go back here. I'll show that in a sec. So he is buried at Elmwood Cemetery, located in Detroit. That's a family plot. Interestingly, his first wife is buried there, as well as Samuel's wife, and his sister Emily, and other members of his family. And if I could say one last cool trip to make history fun, this December, I was able to speak at the Detroit Historical Society, which is where that large painting is located. And I was able to see it in person. And I was really excited to be able to see it in person. And so that's a bit about Eber Brock Ward. But I see we've got a couple questions. So, yes. Yeah. So for anyone who couldn't hear that, in the 1890s was the word entrepreneur ever used? And I think the answer is yes, but clearly that was an era of the so-called captains of industry, or if you thought that these business leaders were positive, you would describe them as a captain of industry. If you didn't like what they did, they were referred to as robber barons. And so I think that the word entrepreneur, clearly he was engaged in many different industries. People like Andrew Carnegie focused on iron and steel production. Vanderbilt focused on transportation. Eber Ward's, do I dare say shtick, or his focus was to diversify his holdings, but also engage in vertical integration as well. Someone else? Yeah. So the question is the payroll on one of the slides, the payroll of $20,000. And let me just go back to that real quick because I think that was not a year, but it was a month. That's what I thought. Yeah. Yeah. So, per person, you mean? Yeah. So, a lot of times, it was between $1 a day and $2 a day. Like if you were just a laborer who was an unskilled laborer, you might earn $1 a day. There would be skilled workers who might make $12 a day. And so a lot of those were unskilled workers. Absolutely. Yeah. So, but those are the figures there. That was just at that particular facility. Right. I know. No. So, right. And so like if you average that out, so some of them would make quite a bit more than the $1 a day. But many others would be there. Yeah. Sure. You had your hand up. Sure. Sure. So first question is Stanley, could you hit on could you hit the home button on that, and it can go to that very first slide, I think, maybe. So the artist, well, how about I'll just get there. So the artist who painted the painting is John Mix Stanley. He was most known for painting Native Americans in the West, and many of his works of art were actually at the Smithsonian, and several of them burned. But John Mix Stanley was a noted artist. He lived in Detroit on and off at different times. So, yeah. And the other question? Sure. So the next question is the Bessemer method. All right. So I'm not an engineer. Okay. And so some of you may know this better than me. However, if you want to make iron, you get the iron ore, and then you put it in a do I dare say bucket, okay, and you heat it, all right, in a furnace, and then you add things like limestone, okay, and then that makes it gets the other impurities, the other minerals out of that, and then you would have something that's more pure iron. What would then what you would do is you would, using the Bessemer method to transform it into steel, you would blow hot air blow air and make it really, really hot, and then add some other chemicals. And so that's layman's terms. Okay, so some of you may know this better than me, but that would be layman's terms. And it was originally in England, and Ward was the first in the United States. And there was a big fight over the patent rights for that. So the question is, was Bessemer stronger than iron? Okay, and so yes, so that's like if you're making iron, if you're making railroad rails without that, you know, they might only last a couple of years, but they could last at least 10 years by using that method. Yes. So you could see some of those so the comment about the beehives that were in the photo in Leland. So you would take lumber, and then you would turn it into charcoal, and then the charcoal would fire at a much higher temperature. And where was it in the UP? In Fayette, Michigan. They've got recreation of that, so you could kind of. Okay, near Escanaba and that. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yep. So great question. Was Samuel Ward involved in the diversification? The quick answer to that is no. So Eber was the one who was the more aggressive partner. And in fact, at one point, Samuel Ward said, "Would you just buy me out?" And one could say, maybe Eber's like, "No, I want you to, I need your advice," and things like that. But what I think is that he wanted to build this huge empire and to diversify himself. He was much more willing to take risks than his uncle was. He was the younger one. He had just this fire with him. And if Eber wanted to have this huge empire, he would need his uncle's resources. So he couldn't buy him out. So that was the one. What was the other question again? Oh, was Eber Ward a philanthropist? I would argue that yes, because his contributions during the Civil War to things like the aid to Kansas. Also, he helped his sister with her program. He wasn't like Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie wrote, oh shoot, what's the gospel of wealth? Wasn't it Gospel of Wealth, I think? Okay, where he influenced many of those others, captains of industries or robber barons, depending upon your perspective, where he said, you and we have a responsibility and we should give back to others. And so Carnegie actually really influenced people like Rockefeller, okay, and many and people who came after him, that you have a responsibility to give back. And so he really changed that. And so I would argue that yes, Ward was involved with that, but not nearly to any level of Andrew Carnegie, you know, with the Carnegie libraries and a range of many other things that Carnegie did. So in a way, but much smaller. Yep. Oh, okay. So why did I study Eber Ward? Okay, so my first book was about his biography of Justice Stearns, who was, if you're familiar with Ludington, the main beach in Ludington, when you drive right into town, is called Stearns Beach. He came after Carnegie, okay, and he contributed a lot of things. He was more of a philanthropist than Ward was. Justice Stearns's wife was named Paulina. Okay, Eber Ward's second wife, Catherine, was the sister of Justice Stearns's wife, right? So Eber Ward and Justice Stearns, and I wrote my first book about Justice Stearns, they were brothers-in-law. And so Ward was much older, okay, but that's what interested me. But also, so I was at a Michigan history conference, and I was with one of my good friends, And I said, you know, you go to a conference and you get a book goodie bag. All right. And one of the things that we got was a copy of the Michigan Historical Review. And I saw it and I was like, and I knew that there was an article there about Eber Ward. And I had been thinking about researching Ward, but I was more interested in another topic. And I said to my buddy, it was Rick Plummer, is his name. And I said, oh yeah, you should read this article. It's kind of good. It's about Eber Ward. It's kind of a crazy story about his will and how he was involved in seances and he had this daughter. And so he read it and he said, Mike, you've got to write this. This is really good. And so it's all Rick Plummer's fault. Oh yeah, maybe, yeah. Sure. So Eber's father was the lighthouse keeper there for, let's just say, 7 or 8 years. And Eber lived with his father at Bois Blanc Island for 2 years. And then Emily, Eber's sister, replaced him as kind of like an assistant for their father. And Eber left. He had a very short apprenticeship, like in New York, and then Eber's father became the lighthouse keeper at Fort Gratiot. He was there at the end of his career. Yep. Yes. So the reason why there is a lighthouse here, and this hit many of the highlights of Eber Ward's career. So that's the reason why that's there, is that it's like, oh, hey, Eber was there for years. And this really is a focus. It's kind of like a biography in a way, of Eber. So it's got the lighthouse and that demonstrates some of his maritime activities. There's a globe and an anchor right here. You can't see that very well, but that's located there. And then there is a his Wyandotte facility where he had his iron mill. And there's a little buoy that you can't see very well, but he used to trap animals. And so there's a little buoy trapping stuff. And so this is really designed to try to be a biography, which is what a lot of those paintings were in that era. Yeah. So he lived in Marine. Oh, so the question was his headquarters always in Marine City? He lived in Marine City, and many of the vessels that he had were built there. They weren't exclusively there, but beginning in 1850, he moved from Marine City to Detroit. And for the last 25 years of his life, he lived in Detroit. It was a strategic and symbolic move on his part, the most important city in the state. And also, he ended up he had close relations with the railroad company. And so he had an office there. So he's grew up in Marine City, but then moved to Detroit, 1850. Yes. So the question is, did it become the McClell Steel Company? And I have to say, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. Yeah. And so if you want to go, so the question is about Bois Blanc Island. So there's a ferry that goes there, and it's from, I'm trying to remember, Sheboygan? No, not Sheboygan. I can't remember exactly where it is, but you take a ferry, and the ferry allows for about 15 cars. And if you want to go there, it is so cool. There's a B&B. There are 2 restaurants. And it's super rustic. And if you are a kayaker or a canoeer, you could, there's wonderful lakes and no houses on the lakes. It was just great. Maybe one other question, because I want to be respectful of people's time. Is there one more? Sure. What about Henry Ford? So the question is about Henry Ford. And so what I would argue is that Eber Ward paved the way for people like Henry Ford. And in fact, at one point, Eber Ward said, you know what, Detroit is going to be a manufacturing hub. We've got the Great Lakes to transport stuff. You've got iron ore in the UP. You've got coal in the South, and we can distribute things all over the place. So in many ways, I would argue that Henry Ford used vertical integration himself, and he copied some of the things. Yeah. And rubber, and so Henry Ford, yes, absolutely. What I said at one of the talks, I said, Eber Ward was Andrew Carnegie before there was Andrew Carnegie. All right. In a way, okay, you could argue he also was a trailblazer before Henry Ford and paved the way for him as well. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you all for coming. For those of you who haven't signed in, if you'd like to receive our wonderful newsletter, and those who do receive it will say it's wonderful, make sure that you sign in when you leave. And the museum is open Wednesdays and Fridays from 11 to 4. But if those times don't work for you, let us know and we can arrange for tour another time. And we have books for sale at the back. Support our author. Thank you.